listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by Gina Garrubbo. She is the president and CEO at National Public Media. We're joined also by Bryan Moffett, the COO of National Public Media. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Heather.
We're so glad to have you on today because I feel like there is so much history that both of you have to share with us. You both have been in the industry for so long. Can you tell us a little bit about NPM and what your relationship to NPR is and kind of what makes your podcast special?
Sure. So NPM is the sponsorship subsidiary of NPR. And we are a full service organization, including sales, marketing, creative, campaign management, because our goal is to help marketers reach their marketing and advertising goals. And we work to do that. At the same time, we're here to support NPR and the member stations. So the sponsorship revenue goes towards that. And what makes NPR podcast specials? Well, NPR has been producing audio for 50 years. So with 34 news bureaus and hundreds of member stations around the world, NPR was able to move into the podcasting space very seamlessly with a storytelling way of speaking that is very NPR. We've been parodied on Saturday Night Live and other shows, and it's evolved over the years in many ways, but it's interesting to note that news, we have the number 2 and 3 news shows on the PodTrack rankings. However, news is only a small portion of the content NPR produces, which includes business, science, technology, culture, politics, entertainment. So it appeals to a wide breadth of audience throughout the day.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things I just love about NPR, I started my career in radio ad sales. And to me, NPR has just always been really synonymous with quality. And I think the approach that NPR takes to the way that they structure their audio is so interesting because I feel like as a listener, the minute that I hear an NPR show, I can be like, oh, that's NPR. And so many people have tried to kind of replicate that format, which is, I don't know, it's really interesting. But so Gina, how did you get into the podcast space and what have you seen in terms of the evolution of audiences?
Sure. So when I joined NPR, it was 2015. And that was really very early days in podcasting, and NPR, WNYC, Ira Glass with This American Life were really some of the earliest entrants into the space. And I've seen it evolve over the years. It's interesting. The audience for NPR podcasts are similar to the radio audience in terms of upscale leaders in business and government, people who care deeply about the world around them. But there's only a 23% crossover between the broadcast audience and the podcast audience. When podcasting first started, it was more male, early tech adopters. And over the years, both at NPR and in general, it's gotten younger and a little less tech savvy and equally weighted in terms of male and female. I will say a thing that we've been fortunate about at NPR is like you said, the loyalty to NPR. 80% of our audience considers NPR personally important to them. And when we produce sponsor messages, it's in the voice and tone of NPR, which Bryan's going to talk about in a few minutes in terms of effectiveness. But there is a halo effect in regard to when the sponsors hear messages on NPR in radio and podcasts, they have an affinity, they really listen, and they appreciate the brands that are there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, talk about a loyal audience. I feel like, as you said, I mean, there is this huge percentage of your audience that has just this real affinity and ownership of it. And I think what's so great about it is, national public radio. It feels like, as a listener, if you're someone who has maybe contributed during a pledge drive, it is your content in some ways. So I think that's really powerful for the listenership and the engagement, which of course kind of brings us to the advertising side of things, which is why you guys all exist, right? Is to help create monetary funds for NPR. And one of the topics that I feel like we have seen come up more, I feel like this year for the first time, really, since I've been in the ad space, is ad load. And I always have to laugh a little bit when we talk about ad load in podcasts because I feel like ad load in podcasting still doesn't hold a candle to how many ads there are in terrestrial radio. But it is a really big topic. So I'm curious, what do you feel like the right ad load is, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. That's a very interesting question. We take this really, really seriously. I'll just as a backing up a little bit. I've been with NPR almost 20 years now. I was on the teams that launched podcasting originally at NPR and kind of built the model around how sponsorship should work inside of podcasts. So we watch this very carefully. We do a lot of focus groups and research with our audience to just make sure we're on the right side of the monetization line, that we still feel like a nonprofit, that the audience feels like the ad loads are where they need to be. And so I think where we've landed now is roughly maybe one ad break or sponsorship break for about every 14 or 15 minutes of content. It varies by show. Some of our shows are hour-long shows and 3 or 4 breaks across the hour. Some of them, like Up First or The Indicator or Shortwave, are designed to be short daily habit shows. They're 12 minutes long, so they might have one ad break in the middle. And that's in addition to a pre-roll and a post-roll. I think one of the things we feel very strongly about on pre-rolls is those need to be very short and very few. We don't have more than one. We have one, and usually they're 15. Some shows might be 30, but that's kind of the maximum because we know that there is drop off, and the more interruptions you put before the show begins, the less the audience likes it. Post roll is a little bit different. I feel like post rolls, there's more appetite there because people have already listened to the show for the most part. And we actually think post rolls are kind of one of the secret weapons in podcasting now because we find they're very effective. And usually the rates are cheaper than a mid roll or a pre roll, but you can get really good performance out of post rolls. So we tend to leverage things like that more than cramming more ads into the show or at the front of the show, because it does invite skipping, it invites tune out, and you can see it when you can measure it on your own platforms like we do within our app. The audience does respond when they feel like there's too many. But yeah, that is something we take very, very seriously and do a lot of research around. I think the other part of that is the tone and the sound of the creative. We've worked very hard from day one with sponsorship to always make sure that those sponsorships kind of sound similar. The audience can recognize them for what they are. Some might be a host read, but if it's not a host read, most of ours are not host reads. It's a handful of people who do nothing but read sponsorship credits. They're very familiar voices, and we know that works. They read them with a nice steady tone. Sometimes our sponsors want us to speed that up or change the inflection, and we don't, because we know that it works when it sounds the same and we can prove it. The other thing we do is we do a lot of work with custom creative and build custom audio creative for sponsors, which Gina can talk more about. We find that also is very, very effective in driving performance for the marketers. But yeah, I think we like to think that we kind of set the standard for how a sponsorship should sound in a podcast. And we've been doing it that way for 15 plus years, and we know it works.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I love that you said that you feel like post rolls are undervalued, because I know at True Native Media, we don't sell post rolls. And I'm always like, no, we don't sell post rolls. Like, they're not effective. But then as a listener, I listen to post rolls a lot. And to your point, I feel like a lot of times I listen to post rolls more than I listen to, especially pre rolls, right? Because if you hit play and the first thing you hear is an ad, you're more likely to hit the fast forward button because your phone is still in your hand. I especially find if I listen to shows like back to back, right? Like if I'm maybe on a cleaning spree or exercising or whatever, and I'm just going to let it go from show to show or from episode to episode, like then I always listen through the post rolls. So I don't know. I find that really, really fascinating that you guys are seeing a lot of benefit there. And I'll have to keep my eye on that. The other thing I feel like is really fascinating is, as we mentioned, there is a certain tone to the way that NPR does audio, and creative is no different than the regular audio. So, I guess, Gina, I'm curious in terms of NPM's offerings, what does your creative department look like and what can you do for the client?
So it's a pretty large production staff that includes video, product production. And I'll give you a few examples of our work. So we create custom audio vignettes
Mm.
for brands that run across NPR's digital platforms. For Organic Valley, they really wanted to tell the story of their heritage and co-op farming, their dedication to quality. So we sent our production team up to Vermont to a co-op farm. They introduced the farmer. You could hear the sounds of the cows, the grass in the background. And it was a very rich audio style, very similar to NPR. And none of this was scripted. It was all, edited in a way that told the story. And I think the best endorsement, we did brand lift studies and could measure via attribution how well the spots worked. They were 2 to 3 minute vignettes as well as 60s. The client, Jacqueline Carden, said on stage at the IAB up front, we always knew how our brand looked. We never knew how our brand sounded until we worked with NPM and NPR. And that was a huge compliment. We probably have 10 brands at any one time doing different custom audio because they love the opportunity to tell their story in an authentic way. We don't do scripting, no actors. We allow brands to tell the story through the voice of a car designer or a customer. For Capital One, we had them talking about a new app they have, CreditWise, which allows you to understand all of the dangers of security with your money. And that was one of our most popular. It's been on for quite some time, but tech security is an evergreen issue, right? And then for Wise, which is money transfer, we had a customer talking about how easy it is for her to do business internationally. And lastly, I'll mention that we also produce podcast series. Our group won an award 2 years ago for a podcast series we did for YouTube called The Creators and the Creator Economy, rather. And we just started creating a 12-part podcast series for ARM, a technology company that designs what goes in chips. And their CEO, Renee Haas, interviews thought leaders. And it's not just about technology. It's not about their products. It's about innovation. It's about leadership. It's about how to see the future and harness it. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, was our first guest, and that podcast got 30,000 downloads so far. And we just launched mid-October. So we have a lot of great guests, including Mike Gallagher, and stay tuned for more. But it is a significant and successful production unit.
And I'll add one thing on that, Heather, because I think that's part of the equation is getting the right creative together. And we spent a lot of time, as you just heard, doing that with our sponsors. The other part is the technology and the targeting to get that to the right person at the right time and the right shows. And I think what is interesting is we have a very bespoke approach to that creative with clients, but most of our clients, probably about 65-70% of our business now, is not around a specific title. It's targeting a specific audience across the entire network of podcasts that we have. And we're fortunate to have a handful of shows that have very large audiences individually, but across our catalog, it's even bigger. And so that's, I think, the other part to success here is taking that really highly developed creative and getting it in front of the right audiences at the right time. And that's just technology and targeting, and also a lot of predictive analytics and looking at performance of previous campaigns. We have a small team devoted to doing nothing but that. They try to make sure that we're going to have a campaign targeted in the right way. And then they do a lot of analysis after the fact to prove that it was, and work with our clients to, especially on a renewal, lean into what worked and build on that success. And that's everything from targeting to measuring attribution to kind of the brand research that Gina talked about. I think going back to the post roll, one of the most successful packages we sell is run of network with a demography or an audience target, and then what we call run of pre, mid, and post, which we just let the ad server figure out what's the best place, the most efficient place to put the message between the 15s and the pre, the 30s in the mid roll, or a longer format 60 like in the post, and let the ad server mix it up. And I think a lot of our clients find a really good performance mix with a line like that versus being like very prescriptive about, I want it in a certain show in a certain format.
I love that. I think that there is so much power in allowing a brand to almost like be not forced, but to try things that maybe they wouldn't want to do otherwise. I think so often there is a perception on the part of the buyer about what is going to be best. And especially for those that maybe aren't as versed in the space or maybe don't have as much experience, being able to show value where they didn't necessarily see value is so incredibly powerful. And not only does that allow you to add on to that campaign and to say, hey, you didn't expect this to be valuable. We knew it was valuable, right? But now you see all this value and you're going to want to continue down this path. And I definitely see how the targeting and the creative go hand in hand to really create the results. I'm curious, I love that quote that you mentioned about being able to hear a brand, because obviously we are in the audio space and we know that there is so much in the theater of the mind. When you're looking at maybe creating one of these soundscapes or a branded podcast, what kind of impact is really kind of had by the brand?
So let's start with helping the brand find their voice. So we'll do A/B copy testing of the different inflections, different voices. Is it a male voice, a female voice? Is it, a really engaged, active voice? Is it a quieter voice? Then most of the brands we work with want to understand brand lift favorability. However, they are allowed to ask about their competitors. They're allowed to ask about certain products and, a different level of understanding, because at NPR, we do have a light commercial load. Our audience is leaning into the messaging. So a lot of the brands we work with are high consideration, right? Financial, technology, B2B, etc. So being able to show the brand lift and favorability studies is key. I'll let Bryan talk about attribution, because that has evolved so much in the last 10 years.
Yeah. And I mean, we've been early into that space. I think a lot of the vendors who are out there, we've been working with for years. So I think we were offering attribution 4 or 5 years ago and have scaled that up. And I think right now, the last time I looked, probably about half of the business we're booking has attribution tied to it now, which has just grown dramatically in the past 2 or 3 years. So I think that's a very interesting space to watch, and particularly for brand advertisers, they are interested in it as well, just to make sure. I think part of it is to make sure you're reaching the right audiences you thought you were going to reach. So the attribution isn't always just about measuring performance. It's about making sure you're hitting the targets that you want to hit. But then you do get to measure the performance of it as well. I think beyond attribution, the other thing we do when we work with brands, and I think what we find is the brands that are the most successful, they work collaboratively with us. I think they're coming with us because we know what works with our audiences. And when we can find that right sweet spot where they let us help them tell their story, that works the best. We also do not just copy testing with audiences in advance, but we can test the actual creative too with audiences in advance and see which variation on a cut of the audio and the soundscape actually works, will or should work better with audiences. And that's helpful as well. I think it all just gives a marketer confidence that their investment is going to pay off. And the more we can do that on the front end, I think the happier the client is. And then the more we can prove it on the back end through the research and the attribution, the better chance we have at a renewal.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that we have so many direct response brands advertising in the podcast space, but it appears to me that you all have more brand advertisers than those direct response advertisers. How are they measuring success? Because, I mean, I know we've just been talking about attribution. Is that the main way that you're looking at success, or what exactly does that look like?
Well, I will say we were very fortunate that we have Fortune 500 brands that have been sponsoring NPR for 20 plus years. So when podcasting came along, we were able to migrate a number of them in there. And of course, they look at brand lift and favorability, but also reputation. A lot of brands come to us because they know our audience is comprised of business leaders, government leaders, even the most senior people in Hollywood. So the Academy Awards time is very significant. So word of mouth and buzz is part of it too. Of course, measuring data is important, but also hearing from their peers in the industry. Oh, I was listening to the Planet Money podcast and I heard your Schwab ad or whatever. You'd be surprised how much of that we hear. Literally, NPR has helped build brands over the years, especially, as Bryan said, in a very targeted way if they're looking for a specific audience. So I think Fortune 500 companies have gotten to understand how to measure the effectiveness of podcasts over the years. And it's all brand lift, favorability, attribution. And then we can also, for our custom audio, measure listening time. So
Yeah. I love that you can measure listening time. I think that that's pretty amazing. And did a study the transfer of trust? Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, obviously we've been talking so much about trust around the audio that you produce, but what did the study say?
So we know that the audience cares about the brands that support NPR, but we had no evidence of that. We worked with a company called Neuro Insights. They actually wire people's brains. And we took one brand, a 15-second fact-based sponsor message versus a 30-second video version of that. And Neuro Insights measured the brain waves during the listening of both of those messages and found that NPR sponsor message produced superior memory encoding. And that translated to trust, because it's sort of like if your friend recommends something, you're more inclined to trust it, but you have to understand it. So you can go to nationalpublicmedia.com, click on Insights, and you'll find the study there. It's fascinating.
That's really fascinating. I don't know that I have heard of anyone who has actually measured brain waves to see. I've used it in this episode. I always talk about the theater of the mind, which I think is very powerful, but that's kind of amazing that you guys really took it the extra step to measure brain waves. I love it.
Neuro Insights is the name of the company, based in New York. Pranav and his team are spectacular. So if anybody wants to engage with them, that's where to find them.
Awesome. I love it. So we've obviously been talking a lot about audio. I know audio is near and dear to all of our hearts, but how is video kind of playing a role in the audio world right now?
I mean, that's the discussion right now, isn't it? That's the big one in the space everyone's talking about. So, I mean, I'll kick this one off. We are an audio-centric company and have been for the past 50 years. So that's kind of where we live. We've done a few experiments here and there around video. For the past couple of years, we would take some of our podcasts and put them up on YouTube and try to find a mix of like an audio-centric podcast, like Up First. Is there a visual we can put on there that would make it kind of work on YouTube? We've tried a few different things, from animation around the logos to putting some B-roll roll images in. And I think what we found is that didn't really zing. I don't think that's what people are necessarily looking for. I mean, there's some listening for sure, and it's probably background listening. But I think when you look at video and what's happening in this space, it's much more of a video of an interview, essentially, right? It's like the people actually doing the talking. So we've done a few of those as well. I think just recently, like it's been a minute, we've had some video host shots that we've done on, and particularly with Wildcard, one of our newest shows with Rachel Martin, we're starting to do more video around that because that lends itself to it in a way that something like Up First doesn't. So that's where we've been kind of experimenting. I'd say it's early days for us. We recognize that it's important and we're still looking to get it right. But so far with our shows that we have in the market, the audio is what works and the audiences are there. And so we're not as interested in saying like, how do we take Planet Money and turn it into video right now? Because it's working in what it's intended to do, which is to be an audio podcast. There might be a video around Planet Money or a video product around Planet Money, and we're exploring those things, but it's not to take what we have and try to turn it into something that it wasn't designed to be, especially when we've already got success with the audience, with sponsorship in the audio-centric versions. But that's kind of how I'd position it.
I will brag a bit about our Tiny Desk concerts. I don't know if you've seen them, Heather. They are some of the most watched video that YouTube has. They are not podcasts per se, but the way people are absorbing podcasts and video on YouTube, it almost doesn't make a difference, but tens of millions of views. We just had Billie Eilish debut her Tiny Desk a few days ago. Incredible buzz. So they're, as Bryan said, NPR will be exploring more and more, but we are an audio first organization.
Yeah, I have not watched those. I'll have to check them out. I mean, that sounds really fascinating.
Biggest names, Taylor Swift. We have a really big one coming out tomorrow. I cannot say who it is.
Ooh, I'll have to keep an eye out. That's fun. Yeah, I love that. And Bryan, I love that perspective. I have such a hard time with it personally because I'm such an audio person for so long. And what I love most about audio, and I would say what I love most about my AirPods is that I can go anywhere and do anything, and I can listen to a podcast. I can listen to an audiobook. And to me, it is so different than video. I see so much value in it. And I get nervous sometimes that we're pushing so hard on video that we're going to leave audio in the dust. And I don't want to do that because it is such an important medium. And it's so interesting because on one hand, I feel like audio is starting to get more and more recognition, especially from an advertising perspective and podcasts in particular. But then on the other hand, it's like we're morphing video into it. And so I don't know. I'm really interested to see how the next, I would say like 5 years play out, because I think that will really see where we're at. I love the study that Sounds Profitable did recently, where I think it was called The Sound You Can See or something to that regard. But I love the idea that people are going on YouTube to discover podcasts, and then they're going to their listening apps to listen to them, because not to go down this path, I still feel like we have discoverability issues in the industry, right? But I do think that it's interesting to see how maybe they can play together. But it is so important to focus on audio and to make audio accessible. So I know that NPR does have a listening app that helps both listeners and advertisers. Bryan, tell us a little bit about that. How does that app work for you all?
Yeah, so that's the NPR app. Actually, it is we just merged two separate apps that we had for probably the better part of the last decade. One was called NPR One, which is about 10 years old now. And that was designed to be a continuous listening experience around audio. And I think we were one of the first to the market to have something like that. So NPR One would take segments from our radio programs, episodes of podcasts, and kind of put them in a linear flow. And we'd have editors who worked on this and produced that flow every day, depending on what was going on in the world that day. And we learned a lot from that over the past decade. I think a couple of the key things that we learned when we first walked into that, it was very much like a Pandora model, and we had thumbs up and thumbs down. And I think what we found was that didn't really work. I think what worked was just watching what people actually listened to versus what people actually skipped. Because I think what we learned through focus groups was when somebody gave a thumbs down on a story, did that mean they don't ever want to hear politics stories again? Or does that mean they didn't like that particular story, or maybe they'd already heard it and just wanted to move past it, or they didn't like the way that one story might have been put together? So what we learned over the first couple of years was watching what people do was the much better indicator of success. And all of it was in the service of trying to get to a longer time spent listening, because that's the ultimate measure of success. And I'd say over the first 4 or 5 years of the app, we started with a time spent listening of around 10 to 15 minutes, which is not too far off of radio. And now it's at 45 minutes. So I think that's what we learned, is how to maximize time spent listening. And it also helped us become better content creators. Shows like How I Built This or It's Been a Minute were kind of launched as A/B tests in that app, where we would do a couple of different varieties of a format for a show we wanted to do and see which one resonated with the audience, which one got better feedback from the audience. And it really helped us dial in the production of a new show. So we still do that today with anything that we're putting out in the market. We did it with Rachel Martin's Wildcard. So it's an invaluable platform for that. And it's really helped us learn how to be better content programmers at NPR. I think part two is, if you can create that kind of an engagement in the app, people listening for 45 minutes, you have their engagement. And so how do you insert a sponsor into that to give them the benefit of that engagement? And that's something we've focused on, particularly over the last few years. Just late last year, we introduced a unit we call the High Engagement Sponsorship Unit. And it is specifically put into those places where we know the engagement is the highest with the audience. And we're not interrupting the content. It's just in between things in that flow. We will put the sponsorship targeted around the content as well, so that it's relevant. And that, I think, tripled the volume of sales that we were getting on just standard units in the app when we were able to do that, because the performance is much better. So I think having your own platform gives you the ability to do things like that. And that's a great thing to have.
Yeah, I am very jealous of that. I just think all of that insight is so valuable. And as you mentioned, it's not only valuable from a content creation perspective, it's valuable for the advertisers. So really seems like a win-win across the board. I'm sure it's really great to have that. Well, Gina, Bryan, thank you so much for joining me today. I have admired NPR for so long, and it's so great to talk with you and talk about NPM and all the good work that you guys are doing to really allow that content to continue to be produced. So I really appreciate it. And if folks are interested in learning more about connecting with you, whether it's from an advertising perspective or other, is there a good place for them to find you?
nationalpublicmedia.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have, and I hope that you learned some really interesting things from really legacy creators in the space. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.